Hi everyone, this is Robin Clare with Tributaries. Today we are going to reintroduce the work of Professor Searle of London via our guest, John A. Thomas. John, CEO of Direct International Science Consortium and author of Anti-Gravity, A Dream Made Reality, has been working with Professor Searle since 1990. Let's find out what's been going on since last we spoke with Professor Searle about their free energy devices and, of course, Searle's anti-gravity disk. Stay tuned. This is Tributaries. John, thank you so much for joining us today and also for writing Anti-Gravity, which is basically Professor Searle's story.
Oh, Robin, yes.
Now, after hearing from Professor Searle last month, my first inclination was to call you to see if you were still involved with his work, and I'm wondering, since obviously you are, if you could trace a brief history for us of how you got involved and why you still are.
Certainly. I became involved with looking for ancient technology and UFO technology, and in my searches I came across some people who are very knowledgeable, Bill and Rhoda Sherwood, and they had worked with John Searle in preparing his newsletters, and in the past, and I read the newsletters and expressed my interest in getting a hold of John Searle, and they had his phone number, and were still in contact with him, even though they were no longer actively doing the newsletters. So I contacted him and became very interested in his responses to my questions and his honesty and sincerity, and came to have a knowledge of his technology as a result of that.
Now, you mentioned at another time that his work, in a way, reflected or certainly acknowledged and jived with some of the more ancient information that you'd been studying initially.
Yes, it has. His whole technology is based on a system called the law of the squares. And the law of the squares represents a coherent number system. And it can be drawn out in the form of a square, say for an SEG power conversion. It would be drawn out in a square 4. And each one of these lines of that square, if you would draw the numbers in them sequentially, will add up to the same number. So they're all even. The vertical, horizontal, and diagonal all add up to the same value. And that is a unique square in that it has not been done before. I looked at other books and other squares and other methods, and they showed a number of different squares, but nothing that will produce power. That's what this square shows, is a representation of a power production.
And do you relate this back to Egyptian times and what they were doing mathematically, either with their building or other things?
It fits very well with Egyptian pyramid building and the ancients. Some of the ancient buildings were so perfect that, like the one at Giza, is so perfect that we couldn't reproduce it today, even with modern tools. So yeah, I believe it is connected because it works in harmony with nature. You can see this when you look at and you go through Professor Searle's books on the law of the squares, and they show the absolute harmony of these numbers and how they fit together and how they work with nature and how they are put to use in building reflects the perfection of the device itself.
Now, as we share more information about Professor Searle, not only today but next week with our interview with Professor Searle himself, it becomes very obvious that working with nature is definitely a basis for how Professor Searle does his work and how important it is. And the fact that pollution of many types is rampant in our world just suggests that most of today's technological devices do work as a force against nature. And how is it that Professor Searle works right along with?
Well, it's found out in his early experiments in building a SearlFX generator, he found that the generator put out a negative electricity rather than a positive electricity that we have today. And also, he noticed that there were benefits from that. In the air in his home where he was using it seemed clear. He said he described it as like drinking clear spring water rather than breathing. And there was no dust, and he seemed to not ever get sick when he was in this field and exposed to it regularly. And because of this, puts in electrons into the atmosphere rather than just vibrating them back and forth and going through a standard AC voltage. It is beneficial for the air, and it cleans it, and it'll actually help the ozone layer.
Well, I could certainly relate it to flying in an airplane where you're breathing all of that recycled air instead of having a recreation of new electrons or new air like you're talking about.
Absolutely. He did have one occasion where he was burned severely by an accident in his home. That was some oil had got left turned on a stove and by mistake, and he was moving it outside and it exploded in his face. And the doctors told him he would be, scarred for life, and he refused to stay in the hospital. And he went to his home where he had his generator running so he could be in that field. And when he went back in 14 days to have the bandages changed, his skin was healed. So he believes that it's a direct result of being in that field and that this device could be used for burn victims.
Well, I'm all over that sort of thing. I think we should all get one running in our homes. Describe the SEG that you've just been talking about, the SearlFX generator, and, in every way, what does it look like? What is it physically made out of? And how did it come about?
It came about through a series of dreams originally when John Searle was a very young boy. And at 15 years old, he had the good fortune of being in a circumstance where he could build one of these. And what the SEG is a series of 3 rings and a number of rollers going around each of those rings. Now, these rings are made of 4 different elements. They're neodymium, he used as a rare earth, and he did that because it has an excess of electrons, which are from the 4 and 5F band. It has a semiconductor, which was nylon, and it had a collector, which was a magnetic layer, similar to alnico, and an emitter, which was a copper, or you could use aluminum. So we have a four element system, and these are put into layers, concentric from the center out. And this is the same for the rollers and the rings. Excuse me. Now the rollers are made from segments. Now the segments are each individual segment has 4 different layers. It looks like a disc, and it is magnetic, and they stack together to form the roller. There's 8 segments in a roller. So you have these segmented rollers that when you impress these magnetics with the proper waveform, we put on a DC and an AC waveform, which is very unusual. And once they are impressed with the proper waveform, they will interact, and the roller will actually travel around the ring because it cannot reach unity. And he found that once this process started, a lot of things happened. It wasn't just a movement of magnetics. It was also a discharge of electrons because it would pull the electrons from the rare earth out through the semiconductor, through the collector, and out the emitter. And when it did that, you had a source of pure electrons coming right from the atomic structure of the neodymium. Now,
and the neodymium is still available. Is that true?
Yes, it is. It's a lot more expensive. John Searle recounts his story of building, and he says he could build it for 35 cents a kilogram. He could get neodymium because it was only used in the past for coloring glass, and they didn't know about the magnetic use of it. But today it's a lot more expensive, but it is available, and we can get it. And that is the primary element.
Now, is it did the cost rise just because of the way everything else rises, or is it sort of known now that it's good for these other purposes?
Well, it became known that it could be used for magnetics, and once they found that you could use neodymium, they came up with a formula of neodymium iron boron, which is a very, very strong magnet and very efficient magnet. And because of that, now all of a sudden the neodymium is very expensive because they have a use for it. So,
happens, doesn't it?
Yeah, right, supply and demand. But we have found some people that have looked for sources for us and have come up with some that are reasonably inexpensive. The ring piece that I bought for the first ring cost me $1,000, and then I had to have that cut, and that was about another $1,000. So it's an expensive proposition for a individual. It wouldn't be a tremendous expense for a manufacturer.
Right, and making the first prototype is always the most costly, and then it can go down from there, certainly.
Oh yeah, it's the first of anything. John explains this to people. He says, if I ask you to build me a brick, you would have to get an oven, you'd have to get the clay, you'd have to make the mold, you'd have to do everything. The first brick would probably be very expensive, but after that, you probably could make it for pennies apiece.
Right. Now, tell us about when Professor Searle did make this SEG device and how it worked. It carried his house for the electronics, didn't it?
Oh, yes. Well, when he first built it, of course, he had the misfortune of having it fly up and hit the ceiling when he overloaded it. That's one of the unfortunate aspects of the generators. If you give it too much load, put too much load on it, it will develop a gravitational field, in essence, and it will repel the Earth and go up.
And this is, of course, how his anti-gravity device was born.
Right.
Which we'll talk about later.
Right. He had no idea why it was doing that, but it did. It did do it, and it actually caused damage to the home that he was testing it in. He uses this, and I used the same generator in his home. The first ones were lost. Now, as I said, he built this one and went up and hit the ceiling. And when he went to get it down, his hands actually froze to the generator because it was so cold. And there was the landlady that he had was there with him, and she actually shoved a screwdriver down into the generator to stop it, which was amazing that it worked. It seems like a dangerous thing to do to me.
I was just thinking that.
And so they got it down, and they got his hands off by putting water on his hands to get his hands unfrozen from the device. And then the next time he built, or the next one he built, he added a lot of weight, a big weight of lead, about 2-inch thick by a couple of feet square piece of lead. So this would keep this in place, so he didn't want it to travel up, go up in the air and hit the ceiling again. So then he loaded it again, and when he increased the load on it, it took off again, and this time it didn't stop. It went right up through the ceiling and through the roof and kept on going, which was very bad for him. And now somewhere in space there's something with hanging coffee pots and toasters and something. I can imagine the report you get back from the astronaut that saw that.
Right. Now, I think it's important just for those in the audience, not including myself, of course, that are technically minded, it's a surprise that it cooled off instead of heated up.
Yes, it is. And this is something that he didn't realize at first. When he was doing some testing, he was running the generator. He wanted to do some soldering nearby, and he couldn't solder. The iron kept cooling off. That's how he first discovered the cooling. But it does cool because of the discharge of electrons, for one thing, is at such a rate that when it increases to a certain point, it goes into a superconductive state. It does this because the electron flow is increased, the temperature decreased because of the electron flow. It actually causes a vacuum around the device itself. The vacuum enhances this process, and the whole generator becomes a superconductor because the temperature ends up going down to a measured 4 Kelvin, so which is very, very low. It's almost absolute zero. And that's when you overload it. Now, it will give off cooling and a cooling effect if you bring it to close to overload, but don't take it to the full overload position.
And that has been worked out at this point in time, hasn't it?
Yeah, that's all been worked out as far as what kind of load the generator will accept, and without going critical, without going, I shouldn't say critical, superconductive. And before it actually goes up through the roof of your home. But we have estimated that this generator that we're looking at building right now would power an average home to approximately 200 amps at 220 volts.
Right. Now, when is the last time that he had one of these generators?
Oh, the last time was probably in 1982. This is the last generator that he had. He did run his home on it. He said he ran his house on it for almost 30 years, and people couldn't. The power company could not figure out where he was getting his power because he wasn't paying for it from them. And he did have quite a few things. He had people coming over, even with news people sometimes with arc lamps, and they would plug into his home, and they still ran their arc lamps right off his SCG. So he did have one then, and unfortunately, through a series of circumstances that's described in my book, he doesn't have one anymore. And when I contacted him in 1990, it was with the idea, and after I spoke to him, I wanted to rebuild his technology to the point where we could have the generator and the flying craft again.
And John, you really need to be commended for having the insight and technical brilliance, really, in order to support Professor Searle in what he's doing. And let's talk a little bit about how he developed the anti-gravity device from there. He went from the generator into creating a kind of a shell around it.
Yes, when he first built the generators, as I described before, they had a tendency to go up in the air if he overloaded them. But he had worked as a young man. He lived with a man that was dying of cancer, and who was interested in John's work because they would sit with him every day after John got home from work and talk about his technology or about the ideas that he had. And so the man encouraged John Searle to, as a young man, to build these devices, and he did. He built them, and the old man said, "Well, John, will they make people look up in the air?" And John said, "Oh, yeah, they'll look up." He said, "Well, then build it, because I'm tired of seeing people with their nose toward the ground and all depressed all the time." So just for a lark, in essence, to see if it could be done, this man financed John Searle as a young man. And John built one and took it off and successfully flew it, but of course he couldn't control it. And it just went up and went up into the air, hovered at about 50 foot. It also had the unfortunate side effect of turning on every radio within a city block, and whether it was plugged in or not, or turned on or not. And so everybody came out to see what was going on, and then they would see this craft would, at that point, would glow and then take off, and you would never see it again. Went into space. So he learned a lot of things from doing experiments such as this with this old gentleman. And he found out that you could give the craft a body because it needed to be controlled somehow, and he didn't know how to control it. And so he did some experimentation with different angles and different designs and came up with a thin disc shape. So it looked very much like a flying saucer. And that seemed to work the best. And the early flights of this caused what they call a ground snatch effect. And what it would do is it would pull a piece of the ground and call it kind of like a bowl shape underneath it when it took off. And also would scorch the ground at that point. And so he realized this was not a good thing. And through a course of thinking about it, he reversed the element layup, meaning the elements right now were in his first units, had the rare earth on the outside rather than the inside. And it did function. But when he changed them around and put the rare earth on the inside to go out, then that eliminated that problem. And that also led to his ability to control the devices with remote control. He would divert the power that was generated by the SEG to the top of the craft, which would hold the craft down. John has told me that it takes much more power to hold the craft down than it does to take it off. So he was able to achieve that with relays, and at the time, they only had vacuum tubes. They didn't have transistors. So all of his remote control had to be done in what we would think is a very archaic way.
I was going to say, that's amazing. He was doing this pre-transistors. And if you look into some of the more esoteric beginnings of transistors, that knowledge is kind of like, where did this really come from?
Absolutely. And it's amazing because, and there is a parallel, because the elements that are used and the way they're put together resembles a solid-state device. The neodymium would be the base of the unit. The semiconductor would be the control gate. And the magnetic layer would be a collector, and the outer copper layer would be the emitter. So it's very much built like a solid-state device, and it is activated as soon as it goes into motion. Everything has to be activated. You could have a transistor sitting on the table. It's not going to do anything unless you activate it. You have to give it a signal and a low voltage.
Now,
and that's what this does.
He made different size of these anti-gravity devices, and I know as of yet there has not been a manned anti-gravity device. Well, two questions. One just came up. Would you volunteer to be in the first manned? And then the second question is that we know he's gotten photography equipment in them, and he's gotten pictures of the outback in Australia that people were saying, how do you know so much about Australia if you've never been there?
Right. Yeah, he made a lot of remote control flights with the help of ham radio operators. They would send signals to the craft at his direction to redirect it and to take pictures at certain locations. And he had a whole network of hams that he was working with. And he did have pictures of parts of Australia that were, relatively unknown. And he would come back and unload the film and then send it right back up. As far as would I be willing to be the first person in a manned flight? Yes. I have to qualify that. Up until this time, there's never been a craft that had a life support system in it. And that's needed even if you fly in the atmosphere.
Now, what does that mean, life support?
Well, life support would be like if you took the space shuttle up, you would have to have a complete life support system because you're in space. There is nothing, no air, no gravity.
I'm sorry, I think you're going where my next question was. So go ahead.
In the craft, there's if you have a life support similar to the life support in say in a spacecraft or the shuttle, you would have your own air and heat. Now the craft produces a vacuum around itself and through the craft, so you would need this life support to survive. It also produces a unique set of circumstances where there is 1/2 G gravity in every direction, meaning top. If you could walk on the ceiling at 1/2 G, or you could walk on the floor at 1/2 G, and that doesn't change. And he did early experiments, remote control with devices that would measure G-force, and he sent his craft up, and it would make turns that were impossible for any normal craft at 180-degree turns at Mach 4. And he would look at his recorders. When he brought them down, he had these chart recorders and devices that he would look at, and there was no change. And he thought they're broken or something's wrong. What's wrong? So he'd send it up again, tried it, no change. So then he went and got a fail-safe device, which was a small glass container that contains radioactive gas in it. And it was set up in such a manner that a force of 2 Gs or more in any direction would break the glass and release the gas. So he hooked this up inside his craft and sent it back up and ran it through all of the maneuvers and brought it back down, and it was intact. So this told him that he didn't have any inertia on board, which seems to go against all modern.
Right. So if I'm not mistaken, as we've seen with people in outer space, they're completely floating all over the place. And that would not happen completely with this. Is that true?
You'd be very comfortable at about half your weight.
Right.
It would be
that sounds good.
Yeah, right.
Pie for dessert.
And yeah, you could sit down and function normally and at 1/2 G, and this would remain constant. And you could do that. Sit down and have a cup of tea while you're making this turn of 180 degrees at Mach 4, which sounds incredulous.
Yes.
But it seems to be proven by the experiments of the past, and we want to verify them with experiments in the future.
Yes. Now, John, we are almost out of time right now, but I wanted you just to briefly mention how good this would be in that it's not only non-polluting, but it also has the way of cleaning things up as it's acting.
Oh, absolutely. The craft would be phenomenal as far as cleaning the atmosphere. It would pump so many negative ions into the atmosphere that it would counteract much of the pollution that we're making today. And as far as the pollution goes, the SEG, or SearlFX generator, could be used in an automobile or in a home or in a factory or anywhere to drive a luxury liner, ship. There's anything that you can run from electricity could be run by this device. And, of course, most of our pollution seems to be coming from the oil industry through one form or another, either factories or automobiles or airplanes, and this would eliminate it entirely. Now, it's a big paradigm shift, and it won't happen overnight. And there's
as
things,
you can attest.
Yes, and there's the economic argument that we could go through, but it can be done, and it should be done. The world's ready for it. It has to be done slowly and integrated into the world, but it can be, and we have to stop the pollution.
Yes, I am with you on that, and certainly I'm sure all of our listeners are also. John, I thank you so much for joining us today. We've been speaking with John A. Thomas, author of Anti-Gravity, A Dream Made Reality. Now, is there a phone number you'd like to give out for people to order that book, or is it best to go to the website, SearlFX.com?
They can order the books right off the website, SearlFX.com. My phone number is area code 585-467-2694. And I welcome anyone who wants to call.
All right, that's great. And next week we'll be speaking with Professor Searl. And in the meantime, please also go to our webpage, www.tributariesradio.org, for information on all of our guests and audio files of our shows, so now they can be listened to at any time. Thanks again to John Thomas. This is Robin Clare. Thanks for staying tuned.